For decades, fans believed the cast of Gunsmoke was as close off-screen as they appeared on television. The long-running Western symbolized loyalty, respect, and quiet strength, and King Curtis, best known as Festus Hagen, was widely seen as one of its most beloved figures. But behind the scenes, things were far more complicated. One key cast member harbored a deep, unresolved resentment toward Curtis, and for years no one dared to talk about it openly. Studio executives stayed silent, interviews were carefully worded, and the truth remained buried beneath Hollywood politeness. Now, long after the cameras stopped rolling, the real reason behind that intense dislike has finally come into focus, and it's far more personal than fans ever imagined. This wasn't a petty disagreement or a clash of egos that faded with time. It was a slow-burning conflict fueled by creative control, personality clashes, and a struggle for respect that quietly shaped the atmosphere on set. While audiences laughed at Festus's humor and admired his charm, tension was building just out of frame. What makes the story even more compelling is how carefully it was hidden. At the height of the show's success, admitting internal conflict could have threatened careers and reputations. So smiles were forced, interviews were softened, and the truth was locked away. Until now. As old accounts resurface and longtime insiders finally speak freely, a very different picture emerges, one that reveals why the hatred ran so deep, why it never truly healed, and how it changed everything behind the scenes of one of television's most iconic westerns. When Gunsmoke first aired, few could have predicted it would become one of the longest-running and most influential television dramas in history. The show wasn't just a western, it was a carefully balanced ensemble built on authority, loyalty, and tradition. At the center stood a commanding lead figure whose presence defined the tone of the series. Around him were supporting characters meant to enhance, not compete with, that authority. And for many years, that balance worked until Ken Curtis arrived and everything quietly began to shift. 10. Curtis joined Gunsmoke later in its run, stepping into the role of Festus Hagen after another character was written out. Festus was different from anyone the show had featured before. He was rough-edged, unpredictable, emotionally expressive, and instantly memorable. Viewers connected with him almost immediately. His humor felt natural, his loyalty sincere, and his screen presence undeniable. Ratings reflected that response, and fan mail poured in. What appeared to be a blessing for the show, however, became a source of growing tension behind the scenes. The problem wasn't Curtis's performance, it was how strongly audiences reacted to it. Festus began commanding attention in episodes that were never intended to revolve around him. Scenes meant to reinforce hierarchy suddenly felt tilted. Laughter landed harder. Emotional moments lingered longer. And for one senior cast member who had carried the series for years, this shift felt unsettling. Gunsmoke had always followed a clear structure, and Curtis, without trying, was disrupting it. According to later accounts from crew members and production insiders, the resentment didn't explode overnight. It grew quietly, episode by episode. Curtis was professional, punctual, and respectful, but his natural charisma made him difficult to ignore. Directors began giving him more reaction shots. Writers leaned into his unique delivery. Producers noticed how audiences responded when he was on screen. And with each small adjustment, the unspoken rivalry intensified. What made the situation worse was the difference in acting styles. The show's lead favored restraint, discipline, and emotional control qualities that had defined classic Western heroes for decades. Curtis, on the other hand, brought looseness and emotional unpredictability. He improvised subtly, played with rhythm, and allowed vulnerability into scenes that were once rigid. That contrast didn't just change the dynamic, it challenged the show's established identity. Off-camera, the distance became noticeable. Conversations shortened. Rehearsals felt colder. Where camaraderie once existed, formality took its place. The cast still showed up, still delivered, still smiled for publicity photos, but something essential had fractured. Crew members later recalled a sense of walking on eggshells, careful not to praise Curtis too openly or compare performances. What's important to understand is that this wasn't about jealousy in the simple sense. It was about control, legacy, and the fear of being slowly overshadowed without consent. The show's lead had fought hard to maintain Gunsmoke's tone and direction over the years. Curtis's popularity felt like an intrusion into a system that had worked for a long time. Studio executives noticed the tension but avoided intervention. As long as ratings remained strong, there was little incentive to address emotional fractures. Publicly, everything appeared stable. Privately, resentment hardened into something deeper, something that never truly faded. This was the foundation of the hatred that would later come to light. Not a single argument, not one dramatic confrontation, but a slow erosion of trust, fueled by success, silence, and an unwillingness to adapt. And in the next section, the story becomes even more revealing because the quiet tension eventually crossed a line that could no longer be ignored, as Gunsmoke continued its historic run. The tension surrounding Ken Curtis stopped being an unspoken undercurrent and began shaping real decisions behind the scenes. What had once felt like a subtle imbalance evolved into something more personal, more deliberate, and far harder to hide. The senior cast member at the center of the conflict wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, he felt his authority slipping in small but unmistakable ways. One of the biggest turning points came during script discussions. Writers, responding to audience feedback, began expanding Festus Hagen's role. His dialogue grew sharper. His emotional range widened. Episodes increasingly relied on his presence to break tension or deliver heart. While this pleased viewers, it quietly frustrated those who believed the show was drifting away from its original center. Notes were sent. Revisions were requested. Scenes were trimmed not for story reasons, but to rebalance attention. Ken Curtis the changes but chose not to confront them. According to later interviews, he believed that professionalism meant staying focused on the work, not the politics. He delivered his lines, respected direction, and avoided conflict. But the environment around him grew colder. Invitations to informal cast gatherings stopped. Friendly banter during downtime faded. Even eye contact became rare. What once felt like a team now felt like a set of individuals sharing space. Crew members later described a noticeable shift in energy whenever Curtis entered a room. Conversations paused. Laughter softened. The tension wasn't loud, it was sharp and precise, cutting through even the most routine days of filming. Everyone understood that something had changed, but no one was willing to name it. In Hollywood at the time, acknowledging conflict between major cast members was considered risky, even disloyal. The resentment deepened when Curtis's popularity began extending beyond the show itself. Fan clubs formed. Magazine features highlighted Festus as a breakout character. Interviewers asked about his chemistry with other cast members, sometimes implying he was the emotional heart of the series. For someone who had spent years building Gunsmoke's legacy, this attention felt less like praise and more like displacement. Behind closed doors, frustrations turned strategic. Creative influence was exercised subtly but effectively. Curtis wasn't pushed out, but he was contained. His character arcs were carefully limited. Emotional storylines were redirected. Moments that could have developed into long-term growth were wrapped up quickly. To the audience, it felt like natural storytelling. To those on set, it felt calculated. What made the situation especially painful was the lack of direct communication. There was no honest conversation, no attempt at understanding. Instead, silence did the work. Curtis remained respectful, but the distance only widened. Years later, people close to the production would admit that the conflict could have been resolved with openness, but pride stood in the way, despite everything. Curtis continued to deliver one of the most memorable performances in television Western history. He didn't respond with bitterness or public complaints. His restraint earned him quiet respect from the crew, even as the tension persisted. In many ways, his refusal to engage in conflict made the resentment toward him even more complicated. By the time Gunsmoke entered its later seasons, the emotional divide was permanent. The show still succeeded. The performances remained strong. But the warmth that once defined the cast was gone. What remained was professionalism layered over unresolved animosity. And then came the moment when the truth finally surfaced, not on set. Not in interviews, but years later, when memories were no longer guarded by contracts or careers. In the next section, we'll explore how that long-held resentment was finally revealed, and why its impact still surprises fans today. For many years after Gunsmoke ended, the tension surrounding Ken Curtis remained largely unspoken. The cast moved on, careers evolved, and the show's legacy was preserved as a symbol of consistency and professionalism. But time has a way of loosening guarded memories. As interviews grew more reflective and insiders felt less bound by silence, fragments of the truth began to surface, and together, they painted a far more complex picture than fans had ever. Above all else, as retrospectives and documentaries revisited Gunsmoke, a few individuals finally spoke more openly. They described a lead figure who was intensely protective of the show's image and deeply invested in maintaining control. Any deviation, no matter how well received by audiences, was seen as a challenge rather than an evolution. Curtis, by simply being himself, became that challenge. One revealing moment came from a longtime production assistant who recalled how certain scenes were rehearsed repeatedly, not to improve performance, but to minimize Curtis's natural timing. His pauses, expressions, and reactions were carefully measured, sometimes reworked, to keep focus from drifting. These weren't official policies, just unspoken adjustments everyone learned to follow. Over time, they became routine. What made the resentment particularly enduring was that Curtis never fought back. He didn't demand attention or question decisions. His silence was interpreted not as humility, but as defiance. To those already feeling threatened, his calm professionalism felt like quiet resistance. Instead of easing tensions, it deepened them. Years later, when asked about the atmosphere on set, Curtis offered only gentle reflections. He spoke fondly of the work, the fans, and the opportunity. He avoided direct criticism, even when prompted. That restraint contrasted sharply with remarks from others who admitted indirectly that emotions had run high and forgiveness never truly occurred. The most telling confirmations came after key figures from the show were no longer around to respond. Family members, biographers, and close associates began sharing stories that had been kept private for decades. They spoke of frustration carried home after filming, of resentment that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. It wasn't a feud in the traditional sense, it was something quieter and more enduring. A sense of being challenged without permission. Fans who grew up believing in the harmony of Gunsmoke were stunned. The idea that such bitterness could exist behind such steady performances felt almost impossible. Yet the evidence continued to align. The patterns, the silences, the guarded phrasing all pointed to the same conclusion. By this point, the reason for the hatred was no longer speculative. It was rooted in fear of change, fear of being overshadowed, and fear of losing control over a legacy built across decades. Curtis had become a symbol of that fear, even though he never intended to be in the final section. We'll examine how this long-standing resentment ultimately shaped how both men are remembered. And why Ken Curtis's legacy may be stronger precisely because he chose dignity over conflict. With the passage of time, the true measure of what happened behind the scenes of Gunsmoke has become clearer, not through confrontation or confession, but through legacy. The resentment once aimed at Ken Curtis didn't fade quietly. Instead, it transformed into a revealing contrast between how conflict is handled in the moment and how it is remembered decades later. What once felt like a private power struggle now reads as a defining lesson about pride, control, and restraint in Hollywood's golden age. Ken Curtis emerged from the experience with something few actors ever achieve: enduring admiration that only grew stronger after the spotlight moved on. His portrayal of Festus Hagen continues to be praised not simply for humor or charm, but for emotional authenticity. Festus wasn't written as a traditional hero, yet audiences saw honesty in him, loyalty without polish, courage without ego. That authenticity is precisely what unsettled the established order at the time, and yet it's what modern viewers value most. In contrast, the individual who harbored the strongest resentment left behind a far more complex reputation. While still respected for leadership and consistency, later evaluations often mention an inflexibility that limited collaboration. Historians now point out that television was changing and Gunsmoke was slowly being asked to change with it. Curtis represented that shift naturally, not strategically. The refusal to embrace it wasn't malicious. It was rooted in fear of losing control over something carefully built over decades. What makes this story resonate is not villainy, but misunderstanding. There were no public arguments, no explosive confrontations, no dramatic walkouts. Instead, there was silence. Silence in rehearsals. Silence in interviews. Silence in moments where honest conversation could have reshaped everything. And that silence, more than anger, became the lasting wound. Crew members who later reflected on the environment often expressed regret. They admitted they had sensed the tension but felt powerless to intervene. At the time, hierarchy ruled television sets, and questioning authority carried risk. Looking back, many now believe that a single open conversation might have prevented years of quiet hostility. But pride, once entrenched, rarely invites dialogue. Ken Curtis never publicly revisited the conflict. Even when given opportunities to clarify or defend himself, he chose gratitude instead. He spoke of the fans, the work, and the opportunity to be part of something lasting. That choice shaped how he is remembered today, not as a victim, but as a professional who refused to let resentment define his career. Ironically, the attempt to limit Curtis's influence failed in the long run. His character remains one of Gunsmoke's most beloved elements, often cited as a reason new generations discover the show. Festus brought emotional accessibility to a genre built on stoicism, and that contribution has only grown more appreciated with time. The truth behind the hatred doesn't diminish Gunsmoke's legacy, it humanizes it. It reminds audiences that even iconic productions are shaped by insecurity and fear of change. Yet it also shows that grace under pressure leaves the deepest mark. Curtis didn't win by overpowering anyone. He won by enduring. In the end, the resentment that once defined backstage dynamics has faded, while the work itself remains. And history has made its quiet judgment clear. Talent guided by humility outlasts control fueled by fear. That may be the most revealing reason why this long-hidden truth still matters today.